All right. Welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I usually don't do these intros, so this is new for me, even though it's like the 50th one of these I posted. I am James. The perspicacious and elephant-brained of you will remember Ilan Kelman, who's joining us again to talk about climate. Esteemed climate scientist, returning guest. These are in some way parallel. And you will see Ashley here as well. Ashley, say hi.
Hi, I'm here.
Um, and so just to do the little spiel that we were doing in private before and thought we might record, I had really enjoyed Elon's conversation with, I believe, Ashley, Dawn, and Jason.
I think it was just me and Don.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which happened, now I'm going to get this wrong as well, but
A long time ago, maybe
oh
18
yeah,
months
2 years
or
ago,
something.
a while ago. I remember I was driving through Wyoming. I remember that. And I remember that Dawn asked, "What is climate?" And then didn't like your answer and persisted in saying, "No, I don't believe that's a thing," which was actually helpful for me as a listener, because I think a lot of us get confused on these kind of big terms. And actually, in fact, hearing Elon's answer to that was kind of illuminating to me, a person who thought I knew what climate meant. So in reprising that a little bit, I had been thinking that I was watching the news of COP29, I believe, in Baku just now. And I would not be the first person to comment on the fact that it didn't seem to get a lot of coverage. The president of the United States did not go. It was held in a major oil and gas producer. And that seemed symptomatic to me of a larger sort of shift in conversation around climate, both in the wider country and maybe a little bit in our circles, where it just feels like, okay, this is maybe a done deal. Or some of the larger scale attempts to address this problem, whether we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act or like big solar, big wind, whatever, have produced some cynicism. And so people maybe aren't even that into talking about climate. And I just thought it would be cool to get someone on board, talk about where we're headed in the Trump administration and where we are today in the larger sort of climate politics questioning world. Uh,
Mm.
Elon, if that all makes sense, I was wondering if you could give us a big picture of where we are maybe 2 years down the road from the last time you talked to us.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of what you said, James, is absolutely right. There is this big concern that a lot of these large-scale international processes are driven by the interests which they are trying to curtail.
Mm.
So it's not just blaming Baku or Azerbaijan this year, it's recognizing it was in the United Arab Emirates the previous year. It's going to be in Brazil next year. And even though a lot of people will say, well, actually, the president of Brazil now is potentially on board, it really is still a petrostate. And those interests, irrespective, are always represented at the COPs. So my view has long been bypass the COPs. Recognize how much a distraction they are. Recognize how much they energy and time and money they take up. I personally have never attended a COP. And that's been a deliberate choice to try and say there are actually other pathways and pathways which are more successful. Even the Paris Agreement from 2015, which was hailed as being landmark and amazing, and we have to go forward, and isn't this exciting? All the contributions for greenhouse gas emission reductions are voluntary. If all of them were met, the Paris Agreement's target for so the agreement is actually in itself somewhat self-contradictory. So where are we? It's up to us. If we don't like it, let's do better. We absolutely do have a right and obligation to criticize, to call out where it's not happening. We also have the duty to ensure we're doing better and to offer alternatives.
So I should have said this before, but maybe it'll be better to put it in your words. COP is an acronym for
The Conference of the
Yeah,
Parties.
conference.
Under the
And parties not,
UNFCCC, which is United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And
right,
there's actually 3 UN organizations which have COPs. So this is the climate change COP. This is UNFCCC COP.
right. And they are parties not to the Paris Climate Accords, right? This is previous. Is that right?
All legally binding agreements have to be passed unanimously. They're passed by consent. There are currently 198 countries, 198 members of a COP. In theory, all the agreements are accepted by all of them, but for an agreement to be enforced, a certain number of national parliaments need to ratify them. So even countries which pretend that they agreed at the COP can just say, oh, well, our parliament didn't pass it, so we're not bound by it, which is the whole administrative bureaucratic approach, which slows it down and deliberately slows down the process of action.
So let's just go maybe a little bit to brass tacks in terms of like last time you guys spoke about climate, and climate is an accumulation of, actually, I'll let you define it again in your answer, but I guess what I'm wondering, if you could help us understand it, just to get to the basics of it, is what was the COP attempting to do?
Yeah.
What, when we get together and we were talking about this years ago, what were we hoping to do, and where are we now, and what does this mean, like, for my backyard? In a big picture kind of way, just so we can establish the terms and then talk about where this all went wrong.
So, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was founded with 2 other UN organizations in 1992. That was a huge Rio summit, which was going to save the world and help humanity.
Right.
A lot has now been forgotten, and I'm certain many listeners were not born in 1992. The idea was to solve what the Rio meeting said are the 3 big issues, which are human-caused climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification. I emphasize human-caused climate change because you sort of said, well, what is climate? Can I define climate? And climate, by definition, is actually just average weather. So weather is what we experience in the air, whether it's wind speed, wind direction, rainfall, other types of precipitation, heat, cold. We measure that every minute, every hour, every second, every day. When we average that, we get climate. The current definition is 30 years. They're talking about maybe changing it to 20, sometimes it's 50, but really if we don't have 30 years of weather data, it's really hard to define climate. And climate change is defined logically as a change in the climate. So it's basically a change in average weather, long-term trends in the statistics. The climate changes naturally. It's always changed naturally. Whether it's mountains being built or eroded through tectonic processes, whether it's forests growing or dying, so they create their own ecosystem for climate, they create their own climate, and certainly the Earth moves in different ways around the sun, so the orbit changes in different ways, which affects how much solar radiation we get, which affects the climate. So natural climate change is just part of what the Earth does. The real concern, and this is why the UNFCCC was founded, was about us changing the climate. So climate change, as per these international negotiations, is what we are doing to average weather. And these 3 secretariats were founded. The purpose was really try to resolve these huge problems. What it's become is a bureaucratic nightmare which distracts, takes up all sorts of efforts, and really has not achieved much, despite the fact that we have just done COP 29.
Mm. And can you wait? Let me just ask one clarifying question too. Were there different congresses that have grown out of Rio 92 on biodiversity loss and desertification too, or was this only COP only resulted from this?
So the Convention on Biodiversity, CBD, has a COP, and the Convention to Combat Desertification, CCD, also has a COP.
And those, like, are they doing anything? Just
You just have one in Montreal, right?
Okay.
Okay,
Montreal is a big center. Montreal makes a lot of money on this conference.
So absolutely. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Secretariat is in Montreal. For climate change and desertification, they're both in Bonn, in Germany.
Um,
Have they done anything? That's debated. I've focused a lot more on climate change, and I follow that far more than the other two. And I think it's very clear that we have not achieved what the idea was during the founding regarding climate change. There have been immense strides in terms of supporting biodiversity and avoiding its loss. Same with desertification. There's a lot of very good practice and some positive examples. Overall, are either of these two much more successful than the climate change one? I actually don't know enough. I do not
Okay.
follow them.
Well, yeah, and it might be hard to compare across anyways because they're different problems. But okay, anyway, sorry, James, go ahead.
no, that's great. And then my kind of like big picture setup question for this conversation reveals, I was going to say my own ignorance, which is probably true, but maybe an ignorance that's reflective in some ways, in the sense that I tend to think I'm pretty aware of a lot of like environmental policy stuff. I tend to think I'm fair to call myself like a semi-professional ecologist in certain ways. But I grew up having been born not that long before 1992, hearing Bill McKibben talking about 350, hearing 1.5 degrees Celsius rise, that's our hard limit. And to some degree, watching us blow through those, or this is the revealing my ignorance part. I take it for granted that we've blown through those. But I've almost taken it so much for granted that these are unattainable goals, and that to achieve these goals, we would have to mobilize society in ways that would be so extreme that they're virtually impossible and like maybe not even desirable. I'm not defending that, but that sometimes is a thought that crosses my head. And I almost am like so checked out of this that part of me is not even aware. I mean, when we take that big average of weather, how far we are past 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. I'm not aware of where we are in terms of parts per million in the atmosphere. And I don't think I'm that rare on that in having checked out a little bit. So I was wondering if you could give us a kind of like, using those sort of like baseball score metrics, like where we are and how far we missed and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're well beyond those targets. We're now on the order of 420 ppm. We have not officially surpassed the global average temperature of 1.5 above the pre-industrial. I mean, that's quite a mouthful of try explaining that, but there's no doubt we are going to exceed it. We are probably already past it. We just haven't said so officially. So you're not alone. Yet, on the other hand, this idea that we should be focusing on parts per million, ppm, of CO2 carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually masks what we are really doing to the climate and why. There are so many greenhouse gases out there which are not carbon dioxide. They include methane, and they also include many which do not have carbon. So in fact, sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, nitrogen trifluoride, NF3, you don't hear carbon in there. They are about 20,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide on certain time scales in certain ways because it's not straightforward. So it's bad enough that we will say, oh yes, 1.5 degrees Celsius above the global mean temperature pre-industrial. You've lost 3/4 of your audience. I'm fully sympathetic with Dawn, who said, but climate doesn't mean anything to me. It's completely out of my scope. It's a pure statistical calculation.
Yeah.
When we start talking about ppm and CO2 and SF6 and 100-year time frame and global warming potential, GWP, of course we lose people. So the key is, what do we need to do and how are we trying to get there? We also have to recognize 2 points because all these layers of nuances. First, giving a global mean temperature like 1.5 above the pre-industrial, or giving a particular ppm of CO2 or CO2 equivalent or greenhouse gas concentrations actually doesn't necessarily achieve what we want over the long term. Also, a particular concentration of a certain set of gases in the atmosphere, which may be carbon dioxide equivalent, maybe all greenhouse gases, does not necessarily lead to a specific global mean temperature rise.
Mhm.
And the other nuance is that geologically, all these gases have fluctuated in the atmosphere as is global temperature. it has tended to be other causes changing global temperature, which then led to particularly carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere changing and other gases. Now we're doing it the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
We're pumping gases into the atmosphere and not absorbing them, and that is leading to global temperature change. So in that sense, we're actually in a global climate regime, or we are changing average weather in a way that this planet has not seen before. So there's so much that we don't understand. What we do understand is we are causing major changes. They have major impacts. We know what to do in order to stop it, and we're remarkably talented at not doing it.
Can I, all right, last question, then I'm going to throw it to Ashley um, to ask more like specifically doomer optimism stuff. But um, I guess we did just elect a new president, and that is going to change how we think about and talk about climate at a high level in this country, and it's going to have global impacts. And so, again, I'm asking you to do these kind of like big picture catch up, kind of like Time Magazine. What is climate, and what are we supposed to do? But like in the spheres that we're in, there's a lot of talk about the complexities and problems with doing the stuff we're supposed to do. For those of you listening to podcasts, I'm making air quotes here, not because I'm cynical, but because I think maybe a lot of us are a little sort of in this world of kind of thinking about the energy trade-offs, the mining trade-offs, the resource use that would go into building the infrastructure that would then become the new energy transition sort of magical, okay, this is now we fixed this sort of thing. And I think, again, speaking only for myself, but I know I'm not alone in this, I hear like, oh, hey, look, you told me it was all carbon. Carbon was the problem. Turns out it's lots of different gases and it's way more complicated. Turns out that actually doing this transition that was promised as a quote green transition is frequently not that green. And we lose sight sort of the big picture of like heading back into the rosy days of 1992. What was it that we were literally trying to do?
Right.
You know, like there's part of me like I'm so lost on that now.
Well, and also, yeah, I think it would be cool to just hear Ilan talk about this a little bit. But like, I feel like everybody is so burnt out on the administrative, bureaucratic, technocratic approach that this is all taken, and like large scale to this to the extent that you like understand why people are like, I don't trust these like scientists and experts who are just going to use this as a guise to like control me in some authoritarian way instead of maybe potentially like, you know, taxing the polluters, and instead it's going to go down onto the citizenry. So there's all this like pushback, or like wind energy. It's like it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's this hugely industrial process. Like there's got to be some better way. So you can see the ways in which people have sort of peeled off over the years, rightfully, and now the whole project seems to be tied up with this kind of like, you know, bureaucratic, technocratic thinking. And one thing I want to talk about now is, okay, so in my opinion, the Democrats kind of represent this like Green New Deal. We can have totally business as usual. We just need to like plug in some solar panels and like everything will be fine. That people have gotten really skeptical of. Not that that means you're pro, let's just drill baby drill and have infinite fossil fuels either. But instead, it's kind of like you don't have to take anything away. They're lying to the public. And then the Trump administration comes in and it's like, is this is my question with a lot of environmental things. Is it better or worse that Trump is a chaotic, unknown quantity? You know what I mean? Where he could have his ear taken by somebody who actually wants to do something practical that you have in mind, Ilan, that would never happen during the Biden administration because they have like these vested interests in connection to these companies and contracts. Anyways, so let's talk a little bit about like where we're at right in this moment on climate.
So yeah, I mean, James Nash, you're absolutely right. This is excellent background and really sets the stage. To answer James' question, which then leads right into what you asked, Ashley, in 1982, the baseline was we've one planet, we're one species, we're not doing that well. So the key phrase is sustainable development. Another document that came out was Agenda 21, which was meant to be for the 21st century, making it local, aiming for sustainability. These are just
Is
words.
that, sorry to
This is
stop you, that the same
yeah.
thing as the quote sustainable development goals?
No, so they were different.
Okay.
So part of the impetus from this idea of aiming for what was called sustainable development then led to the Millennium Development Goals, which were 2000 to 2015, which
We're
then
so
became
good at making the
Sustainable Development Goals. See,
damn
Ashley, you're
goals.
absolutely right. Yes,
We're so
we,
good at
we've
that.
lost, right? We've just completely lost it. But Rio 92 was not the beginning. There was a Stockholm meeting in 1972.
Mm.
Mhm.
I'm certain none of us was close to being alive in 1972. And then it goes back earlier. If anyone knows the name Willy Brandt,
Yeah.
okay, Chancellor
Sure.
of West
Yeah, the West
Germany.
German chancellor.
Yeah.
Um,
And he was definitely a sustainable advocate and published some very key documents. So this is long term. Certainly, Rio was seen at the time as a turning point, but yeah, people have generally forgotten it today, and understandably. The idea was we should be doing a lot better for ourselves and for the planet by not consuming so much, by not destroying so much nature, by not destroying so much of ourselves. So where are we now, Ashley? Well, what's happened since 92? What do you think?
Everything's worse.
It's a balance. There is definitely gains and there's definitely losses.
Mm.
And if people don't like a certain president or a certain administration, we are so fortunate to live in a comparatively free and democratic country. You're under no obligation to follow their politics. Certainly, we're all under obligation to follow laws. In the US, not all laws are federal, some are local, some are
Right.
state. So you don't have to. You obviously have to take laws, as just said, but you don't necessarily have to follow the policy direction or the ideology.
Mm.
So if you like what came out of 92, 1992, or 1972, or the 1960s, or before that, do it. Adopt it. Where are we now? In the US, highly polarized. In the US, all sorts of inequities, which mean that, yes, although it is a democracy, there is definitely a level of subversion, and there's definitely a level of excluding people who most need to vote and who need to gain the most from their government. There's also an understanding of some of the limitations, as you mentioned, Ashley, of democratic administrations. And there's no doubt trying to deal with the federal government is incredibly time consuming, incredibly bureaucratic, incredibly administrative. People are understandably frustrated, and people are also understandably hurting. It has been years of intense difficulty. It has been years of intense stretching budgets, of insecure jobs, of not even knowing whether there'd be enough food on the table, and at times, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, not even knowing if we're fully safe to even step outside and go shopping. That takes its toll.
Mm.
Wonder people are hurting. No wonder they're frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
Are we better now than in 1992? Not in all those contexts. We are much better because we have so much more knowledge, so much more understanding. We know where the money is there. And of course, in 1992, we didn't have these sorts of podcasts where none of us had ever met, but we can have a wonderful conversation. So it's about using what we have in the best way possible without trying to denigrate people's experience, without trying to tell them, oh, yeah, everything's better, isn't it? Because in many ways it's not, but in many ways it could be if we were able to mobilize ourselves with what we have, recognize we're not going to agree all the time, which is fine, but nor are we bound to follow certain policies. We are bound to follow laws.
Yep. Okay, so now I'm curious to move into like the optimism part of the conversation, which is maybe there's a lot. I'm assuming there's a lot here because part of my critique of just climate change as the sole environmental problem people care about is that not only do all these other problems sort of fall by the wayside and people stop paying attention to them, they also attribute environmental problems to climate change that aren't. And Elon, you talk about this all the time on these various listservs that we're on together where people will say, oh, look at these wildfires that are caused by climate change. And he writes back like, no, they're not. And this like
Or when the Washington Post put that there was that earthquake in New Jersey, and the Washington Post like put it under the rubric climate crisis.
Yes.
yeah, right. And so it's like the whole thing is sort of taken up the oxygen, and then on the other hand, you've got all this like political polarized opposition to this environmental problem just because it's now associated with like the sort of grifting technocratic, techno-optimist future, bureaucratic future. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, you said twice, bypass the cops, we know what to do. So let's start.
Bypassing the
I
cops.
don't know what to
I'm
do.
really into that philosophy. Let's keep that up.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So like, let's get started on solutions. And I'm curious what you think. Because I mean, I agree with James. Like sometimes I think downstream of fossil fuels, like building every aspect of our society that almost nobody pays attention to, and changing that is so overwhelming, just how much energy is in this tiny amount of material, and how much is downstream of that fact, is a little overwhelming. So yeah, let's start talking on the optimism, because I'm not even that sure I'm that optimistic on this problem. I don't know about James either, but I'll let you make us
Well,
up.
ultimately, what do we want? I mean, James, Ashley, what is your goal? What is our goal?
Well, okay, so I was gonna have you do this because I feel like you can give the scary bedtime story. But I'll give the scary bedtime story, right? Like
Okay.
I remember you talking about wet bulb body temperatures and a certain like basic human limit at which like you combine a humidity rate and a temperature and things just stop working
Yeah.
in our bodies. And I think you described very eloquently before, and I've experienced this in my own, I guess, ecological work, not to overstate it. But it's not, I think people, particularly on the American right today, look like they glom onto this idea that a changing climate is part of our history. We've lived through little ice ages. Well, humans lived through a big ice age. We lived through rapid warming that ended both of those. Why can't we do it again? I think the argument here would be that the rapid warming we're experiencing is unprecedented, and that like you're faced living today in the West with a moral choice. Maybe you like your free living kind of, maybe you're sympathetic to Dutch farmers who are like, I don't want to have my cows restricted. Okay, I am. I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I try to remain sympathetic to people living in Karachi, and to a vision of the world. I'm sympathetic to a vision of the world that involves being able to go outside during the 6 warm months in Arizona and not literally die. And I don't think that we're gonna, you're fundamentally, you are a techno optimist, even if you say that as a denigrating term. You are a techno optimist if you think that you're gonna allow this temperature rise to continue and then solve all your problems with air conditioning. Because
Right.
presents its own set of energy problems.
Right.
And you are ignoring the vast numbers of millions of people who are going to face a temperature and humidity limit where they are going to be experiencing body temperatures that kill them.
Right.
And so I guess the thing that I wrestle with a lot personally in my politics and like how I approach this policy stuff is, I just spent a long time in Africa where I used to live. And I was in Mauritania, and the family I was staying with, they're talking about in Zorat that it gets up to 60 degrees Celsius in their home in the summer. 60 degrees Celsius. You guys can do the math, but it's extremely hot.
Yeah.
And that is new. And their nomadic way of life, it's not purely greenhouse gas caused climate change. There are more complexities to what's happening in Sahara today than simply us releasing a lot of petrofuels and this sort of thing happening. But part of it is that. And part of that is destroying a traditional nomadic way of life where there's just not enough fodder, not enough water. That system's not working. And I have had arguments with people in our sphere who are really accomplished scientists and stuff. And I'm not a climate scientist. I can only go off what I'm seeing. But I'm seeing a rapid rate of change here in Southern California and in Sahara and places like that I trust can be attributed in some way to human caused climate change. And I think that you are faced with the real kind of like question of putting on the blinders and saying, hey, I don't like these policies, or hey, like I don't want to see runaway basically like top down investment in a bunch of like industries that involved mining and laying waste to landscapes and then
Right.
producing a whole new sort of like energy elite and this kind of thing. And you might not like that, but if you don't, then you better figure out a different way to talk about this stuff. Otherwise, you're just kind of making a moral calculus and saying, I don't care about it.
Yeah.
It's outside of my purview.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that answered your question, Elon, but that's sort of where we're coming from. I think if I might speak for our
Yeah.
broader circle, is trying to
Yeah.
like square that problem.
Yep.
Yeah, heat humidity is the exception. It is terrifying. It is direct. We can now directly attribute deaths in heat waves, or a certain percentage of deaths in heat waves, to human-caused climate change. That is happening now. It cannot get better. It's going to be far more devastating in the future than it is now. And the only real approach is exactly as you said, we have to stop human-caused climate change. So yeah, do we really want to go 24/7 artificial cooling? Do we want to only farm at night? But how do we protect the crops during the day? We cannot escape that heat humidity. It is an exception. It is a terrifying exception, and it stands alone in saying we are experiencing it now, and it justifies focusing on human-caused climate change. Unfortunately, that's not going to convince those who aren't accepting this approach, who aren't accepting human-caused climate change, who are scared of the change. And that's where we can say, well, actually, there are many disasters which we let happen, which come from floods, which come from droughts, which come from storms, tornadoes, hail, blizzards, and we can absolutely attribute some of that weather or the changes in the weather to human-caused climate change. But the disaster does not and should not be linked to human-caused climate change. If we live in a hurricane zone, we should expect a hurricane during hurricane season. So even the major hurricanes this year, Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton in Florida and North Carolina and Georgia and other states, there is a strong likelihood that they were slightly stronger because of human-caused climate change. But they were far from the strongest hurricanes that have ever hit those areas. So if we're not even ready for a Category 3 or Category 4, then of course we're not ready for Category 5, even though we know a Category 5 has happened and must happen. So this is exactly what Ashley was saying, that we don't even have to invoke climate or climate change or human-caused climate change to ask the question, well, what do you fundamentally want? Do you want to live? Or do you want to die in a tornado? Do you want to die in a storm? Do you want to die in
Right.
a flood? Do you want to be trucking in water and paying for it during a drought? Or do you actually want to use the resources we have, the knowledge we have, the abilities we have to ensure that everyone can get through this weather without much of a disaster?
Mm.
And if we get people on board with that basic day-to-day living, with just the weather they're experiencing without using any of these C words like climate or change, then we can get people on board regarding what we can do to avoid disasters. A lot of those actions end up tackling human-caused climate change,
Mm.
which then helps us avoid the awful, the horrific, the horrifying heat humidity we're experiencing now, and which is only going to get worse, and that is directly attributable to human-caused climate change. Yes, we have had heat waves in the past, nothing like what humanity is experiencing and will experience.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I have one example, and then I'll throw it to you, James, to ask a question. But I just interviewed a young man on the podcast who's like, I think he's like 20. He's from Iowa. He is a soybean farmer, and he was like he had this sustainability challenge in his head, and he's been talking about we need to till our land less because we have these more drought and more flood experiences than we have had, historically on our farm. And so we got to be able to keep the plants growing in these extreme circumstances and not erode everything away and et cetera. So he invents this tool to measure soil compaction, et cetera. But he was also saying putting cover crops in the ground helps my yields. And he was in this competition with his dad to have better yields. And then he's telling me on the podcast, oh, I got some portion of the land and my dad got another portion. He did conventional. I did my method with cover crops. And he's like, his yields were super high. And he was like, and he's like, I don't even know if I should say this. All right, I'll say it. My dad filed crop insurance. He was like so proud of that fact. So I have a lot of hope in these little
Yeah.
stories where it's kind of like it's it's less like the theoretical concept of climate change than we go to the COP and then, France decides to do something. And so we're in competition with France. So we're going to do it. And we're going to set some policy. Like it just is not working. That way of doing it's not working. The way where people are adapting to the real world disasters as they come, soil erosion, drought, flood, extreme heat, then they start to think I have to do something differently. They're sort of forced to change, but then that sort of method it helpfully impacts climate anyways, even though that wasn't their original intention, like this concept of climate, but instead more like I want to keep the soil in the ground and not have it erode away. And I want to use less inputs because it costs less to do it and I'll have more money for our farm. So this kind of thing is where my hope is. It's just a matter of scale and like how fast it gets rolled out. Do we adapt to these things soon enough before then there's like a period of disaster? I always think about this, period where things are declining and people are adapting to the decline by changing their practices. But this cross moment is always a question like, would it be fast enough? James, you go ahead.
Well, no, that kind of leads into what I was going to ask, which is like we've been talking a lot here about like we're not doing it, or like the thing that we're not doing, the thing that we have failed to do, and that sort of thing. And I guess bumping off what Ashley was saying there, just to divert my question a little bit, in the kind of big picture, I think there's maybe two approaches that people talk about, or that might have been taken starting in the early 90s, where one would be like just less global growth, less development writ large, like a system that moves less quickly and produces less stuff and uses less energy.
Yeah.
For various reasons, as much as I would like for that to have been an option that was plausible, or that we took, that never truly felt like a plausible option to me. The other option is this kind of like innovate your way through it, this kind of like very, I don't know, you could call it neoliberal vision of like all problems can be solved with enough application of technology, expertise, and capital. And that feels very much like the path, not only that we took, but that was inevitable that we would take under the system we live in. But that becomes very abstract to me in certain ways. And it has sort of ended up being this thing where you have a combination of regulatory tinkering at the margins where you can get to it. And so you can have, in Europe, you can have a lot of like agricultural regulations and stuff because you're trying to play in political spaces where the possible exists. And then you can have these big top-down discussions of everybody's going to have an electric car or something. But I was wondering if you could just speak to like, again, in terms of the stuff that we haven't done, so we can then figure out things to talk about along the lines of Ashley that you could do. If you had been elected president of the G7 superstate, it all got, because leave aside China and Russia and places where they're maybe just not going to get on board with nothing regardless. You were elected into the president of the superstate of the happy liberal democracies where everybody at least pays lip service to this stuff. What would you have done? And what did we not do?
I think it's both. So it's these local stories which are so inspiring, Ashley. I mean, that farmer from Iowa, that is so wonderful. So thank you for interviewing him, publicizing it. This is what we need to know. Innovation and technology have to be part of it. I agree with you, James. It should not be the driver. It should not be the only one, but nor should we leave it out. It's using everything we have, the richness of our scientific knowledge, technical knowledge, indigenous knowledges, vernacular, local, in order to work together. And so if I were this super emperor, I kind of like that title, maybe others don't, then I would seek the balance, always ensuring we're being positive. What we are not doing, we often find examples that it is being done somewhere. So are all farmers in Iowa following this approach to cropping? No. But one then becomes 10, becomes
Mm-hmm.
100. suddenly we have a state. Same with Florida. Absolutely. Many places, surprisingly, were really badly hit by a hurricane. Like Florida is not used to hurricanes, but there are stories coming out, places like Cortez in Florida and Babcock Ranch in Florida, which actually seem to have done very well in the hurricane because they were ready for it and they are very much looking at local transportation systems, local energy, and ensuring that they are a community so people support each other. We have a website called disastersavoided.com with two colleagues, Anna Prados and Gareth Byatt, who set up the website, where we are collecting examples of people who acted to avoid a disaster despite a hazard. So a lot of people are not doing that, but some are, and perhaps they can be inspired. Places like Toronto, Ontario, Seoul, South Korea, Boulder, Colorado, which said we actually have a major flood problem in the center of the city. Let's change the river into shockingly a river and have the floodplain amazingly as a floodplain rather than people living on it.
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
radical is it
Yeah.
to let a river expand when it rains? How devastating to say, oh, maybe we don't want people dying in a flood. And those cities have done it and they show the results. But we
Mm.
still see many cities where it hasn't been done, like south of Valencia, Spain,
Mm.
with the appalling devastation, none of which should have happened. Even in July 2021, when we saw what happened in the Alps with almost 250 people killed, starting in Switzerland and Germany and then moving downstream. Yet some of the places which were the worst hit in those July 2021 floods had flooded many times before over previous centuries.
Mm.
So people hadn't done it, even though past sort of decades, Seoul, Toronto, Boulder, Colorado have taken lessons. We know what to do. Getting the politics, getting the resources, getting the inspiration and the action to do it is part of the challenge.
Mm.
And this is where absolutely these local stories and what you write about, James, what you do, Ashley, will hopefully bring more and more people on board in a ripple effect.
Can I play devil's advocate though?
Yeah, you go.
Just in the sense that, I mean, we are a localist podcast here. We're local. We like local things. But to me, like on a scale of changing a global climate system or changing the rate of change of a global climate system, if we want to be more precise, in the face of a Russia and China who are only going to pay lip service maybe to some of this and that sort of thing, like, forgive me if I sometimes just don't feel like the Iowa farmer, like, great, make resilience for your own thing, but like that's
Yeah.
not changing much. But like, and so I become slightly cynical about these things in a way that apparently, Elon, you are not. Um, but can I just play devil's advocate here in terms of like, don't we need to do something far bigger than that? And what is that thing that we haven't done?
Mm.
That is a question. And how do we bring Saudi Arabia on board? How do we bring Brazil on board despite the current president? All these countries do have many good local initiatives. The counter argument, and you've said it very eloquently, James, it's not just devil's advocate, it's a real challenge, is that the wider forces, the structural forces, the countries and the government are potentially doing a lot of damage and can definitely overwhelm these local initiatives. So this is sort of a long-term approach. This is a long-term challenge. Are we talking about democracy? Are we talking about freedom? But do you believe the US has democracy and has freedom? Certainly in comparison to the other countries, it still has limitations, as does the UK. This is the difficulty which Ashley raised earlier of making everything about climate change. Because how are we going to solve one environmental topic when we have these countries, these governments, which perhaps are not the most friendly to their own citizens, never mind the planet? So is it that we do need democracy and freedom in order to achieve that? Is it that we need to equity in order to ensure that don't have the huge rich poor gap, that we're actually capping or limiting the amount that any individual can own or acquire? Maybe it's not about democracy or freedom, it's about equity or equality, however defined. These are the big questions. I absolutely do not have answers. What we need is more people on board having these discussions, joining journalism, joining activism, joining science to try and see what works. What we do know is we can go back 100 years or 400 years, and governments were not that helpful to their citizens at that time either. Come from a long way.
Yep.
We moved, however, slowly. We cannot wait another 100 or 400 years. What I can offer is examples of positive, constructive change that we need on the generational timescale. What I have not found, and I would love any listener, even yourselves, to offer me, do we have an example of global, rapid, constructive societal change? Something which happened very quickly and actually helped us. Some people say, well, look at the COVID-19 pandemic. We basically changed overnight, and it really saved so many lives and helped a lot. But so many people were hurt by those measures. And we knew they were going to be hurt, and yet we didn't do anything to try and stop the harm. I mean, the whole point to me of lockdown was so that people could still see their doctor and get cancer treatment. And yet that stopped. Imagine telling someone, oh, yeah, your cancer is treatable, but you're going to die because we have to go into lockdown.
Right.
How devastating was that?
Right.
So there were very appropriate responses to some degree in March 2020, but it really did not counter the troubles which we knew were going to happen. It did not acknowledge the people who were suffering, who we knew were going to suffer, and it would have been so easy to be ready to support those who needed support. Instead, lockdown just became, well, don't do anything, and that was entirely unhelpful. So again, it was good and bad. Do we have examples of global, quick, positive societal change?
Okay,
Well,
so yeah, you go,
okay, no,
James.
you go. Actually, I've been talking a lot.
Okay, so I mean, the way that I think about this is maybe in some ways very doomery, but probably, I mean, it leads to a very specific form of optimism. So I think a lot about like the collapse of complex societies and have since, I was in college and I took this class called Is Development Sustainable? And the answer to the class was basically no. It's just not. It's not sustainable to develop. And like in the way that we are in this growth paradigm, whatever. And then I was like, well, what did other societies do? And, reading like Tainter and for, Jared Diamond and, all these people. And I tend to think less about collapse than like transformation. Like the Roman Empire collapsed. It probably overdid it on the agriculture and the soils, but then it sort of just transformed into this Dark Ages that then transformed into a Renaissance. And we're on a different scale now because it's a global empire and it's a totally the amount of destruction is so different and unprecedented. But there's also, I don't know, there's demographic shifts that are happening with population, et cetera. But one thing that's positive about all of this, at least for me, is you can neither be a super hardcore doomer who just sees everything like you said, James. And there's a guy who's been on the podcast before, Bill Rees, who I appreciate his insights, but he is the doomeriest guy on the planet. And anytime anyone says something positive, he's like, no, it's as worse as it's ever been. It's only getting worse. Nobody's doing anything about it. And when you get into that mindset, you just like spin out to the point that you almost don't want solutions because it then undermines, not that I'm not saying that that's true of Bill, but there are people out there who almost like their identity is spinning out on how bad things are. And then you neither want to be that because that doesn't give you any agency, nor do you want to be somebody who just puts their hand up and says like somebody will innovate their way out of this, like the nuclear bros who are just like, just do nuclear, it's fine. Like as if our grid is set up for everything to be electrified. You know what I mean? Like there's space in between those two extremes, and that's the exact space, the only space we can occupy in my mind. And I think about things like people have asked, the George Monbiot like industrial food system, like they're gonna like take away our right to produce food. They're going to say you have to buy this industrial food. They're going to say, they're going to do all of this stuff in terms of environmental innovation that like forces us to not have any freedom. And then having a homestead is going to be considered like dissident or, And people get really spun out about that. But what can you do? What all you can do is what you can do in the agency that you have.
Actually, you're kicking right into the example, the controversial example I was going to give here.
Okay, go.
Question, which would be the Green Revolution. Um, and not, I'm saying this kind of as a joke because, of course, a lot of people listening to this would regard the net products of the Green Revolution as being probably kind of negative. But it was an instance under which basically like an NGO and some scientists working then with the help of government were able to export a food production system really rapidly that changed the world in the matter of like minutes. And I mean, there, if you had predicted the downstream effects of the Green Revolution, even a few years before that started to get underway, I don't think anyone would have believed like the production numbers that you were going to start getting out of like third world like economies and stuff. You wouldn't have believed that you were able to feed as many people as this system can. And so like I don't know, Elon, like the reason I bring that up as a controversial but perhaps salient point is that it seems like when we talk a lot about climate, what we are looking for basically is some kind of reproduction of the Green Revolution. This a sort of like technocratic tinkering, a little bit of innovation, government private partnership, and suddenly like boom, world changed. And for various reasons, it seems to be something that people keep pushing on, but it keeps not working. And my thesis would be that the reason for that is that a climate is just way more complex than producing food in a way that you can sort of measure inputs, outputs. Okay, this works, we can reproduce it. And B, actually, the way that the Green Revolution came about would be basically impossible to effectuate today because of because the distrust that we have in technocracy and these kind of partnerships and the in fact way that the Green Revolution functioned to centralize agriculture. These are things that for various reasons in the West suddenly like get people really angry. And you brought up earlier Agenda 21. I remember like in the late or the early 2010s, like I was reporting a lot on ranchers on public lands in the West. And Agenda 21, people brought it up all the time. Like this is the new world order. Like we've got to stop Agenda 21. Like at these meetings, like in little town halls, little churches, people were talking about always Agenda 21. And so there's this kind of like latent feeling, if you might identify, at least here in the US, this latent feeling that is now burst out into our mainstream politic of just rejection of that kind of solution, that kind of like revolution that the Green Revolution produced. I'm losing my thread here a little bit, but the moral of the story being, I'm not actually sure we could do that, but I'm not sure what else we could do. Do you have thoughts?
Well, then let's do a thought experiment. So when we're talking to these people, they are understandably suspicious of top-down big government. They're understandably suspicious of being controlled by these centralized forces. Do you, James, want lower taxes?
In general, yeah.
Ashley, do you want
Not
lower
a
taxes?
dogmatist about it.
Yeah.
So let me get you lower taxes, both of you and all listeners, and let me get big government out of your lives. Stop fossil fuel subsidies. The long-term average of direct subsidies from governments to fossil fuel companies has been over $400 billion a year.
Mm.
In 2022, it exceeded $1 trillion. When they look at indirect subsidies, its calculation started on the order of $4 trillion a year. Then we're probably looking at possibly 7, maybe even up to 10. That is our money from our pockets going to subsidize the yachts of CEOs of fossil fuel companies.
Mm.
It is big government taking your money and giving it to those rich people. So if you distrust big government and you want lower taxes, let's have a neoliberal economy, let's have a level playing field, let's remove subsidies from the energy industry.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how those subsidies work? Because somewhat to my discredit, how are those delivered?
It's in all sorts of ways, often through loopholes, through tax breaks, sometimes direct handouts, but not always. So there's also the debate about what is the subsidy defined as. Now, as soon as we start that, we're going to lose half the audience. So I'm not going to go into that. Again, it's about the messaging, right? If we're having an intellectual discussion, if we want the next 5 hours, We could discuss the definition of subsidy, go through tax loopholes, other forms of loopholes, direct handouts, grants, and all the other forms, as opposed to just saying to the audience, do you want lower taxes? Do you want big government out of your lives? Interesting, of course, renewables are subsidized also, but they're subsidized to only the tune of $140 billion a year. So if we removed all subsidies, fossil fuels would suffer so much more than renewables, we would end up having to have localized, appropriate, cleaner, sustainable energy systems,
Mm-hmm.
and people would have lower taxes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like so obvious that so many of these industrial systems are completely, the scale's totally tipped in their favor in a way that's totally stifling innovation. And that's one thing that is is such an obvious slam dunk in terms of like a policy solution to this. Like there's so many innovations just sitting on the horizon, and because gas is so cheap, people are not gonna be forced, the market's not gonna be forced to develop those. I also think like if I think big picture, like James, if you think about the conversations we've had with Peter Allen on this podcast and in our events, I think about one thing that bothers me a lot is this degrowth approach, even though I like a lot of the degrowth critiques. But the degrowth messaging is basically like everything needs to just be less and less. And I would say there's a different kind of positive messaging that's out there that's it's less of some things but more of others. And I'm thinking about like, for example, we talked to Peter Allen, who's a PhD level ecologist, and he was saying like, there's a way to manage animals on a landscape that has like almost inconceivable amounts of increased productive capacity if you manage them in a certain way. Like there's a lot of space for more, and I think that I think the question we have on this podcast a lot is what is a positive vision that really draws people in? And I think like it's like low tech, it's like a totally abundant ecological future, like John Muir pastoralism of, people getting out into the wilderness again and like managing landscapes, reintroducing species. People love that. And all this appropriate tech stuff. There's passive solar, there's all these gray water systems. Nobody's using these things, letting rivers be where they're supposed to be. Like, it's like there's a lot of stuff that's just really straightforward. New urbanism, this kind of like low energy cities where not everything is so energy intensive to get around, like Houston, that this is a better way to live anyways. People like these cities. So it's really just but not that that's an easy thing, like you just transform all of Houston, like, you know what I mean? It's not that that's going to be super straightforward. It's just that there is a vision out there. It's pretty straightforward. It's not one of everybody's suffering, but instead could be one of really great abundance, but you have to actually execute it.
Can I jump off of that, Ashley, just to
Yeah.
ask Elon a question? First of all, I was going to say that my line about degrowth, that don't steal this, anyone listening. I'm sharpening it, but something about how in these spheres we're not degrowth, we're growing soil, something like that. Like
Nice.
the
Okay.
vision of abundance,
I'll bring that.
But I mean, going off that, Elon, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand what you were saying earlier to mean logically that if we were to hurt both of those industries by removing their subsidies, and the one would be hurt more, still the broad outcome would be that we were producing less energy total. Probably, right? Is that and I say that because like I talked to Peter Kalmus maybe a year and a half ago or something, and we had this long conversation about how climate politics and like how people on the right could be convinced like, and some of this doesn't have to be big government, blah, blah, blah. And it felt to me typical of a lot of conversations I've had with climate scientists, where at the end of the day, where it got down to was we have to produce and use less energy. Like he didn't really have a solution for this thing that involved us not producing less energy and producing less stuff. Is that your sense amongst your peers as well, that actually like it's just not going to be super possible to tackle this stuff without reducing energy consumption and probably economic growth throughout the Western world?
The fundament of these environmental problems is overconsumption. So certain individuals consume more than they actually have to for fulfilling lives, livelihoods, and lifestyles. My sense is that people don't go out to say, I love turning on the lights just to use electricity, and I'm going to sit and watch my lamp because I love seeing that electricity being used. If we
This is
can,
America. I don't know. There's some people who do.
it
I
could
mean,
be,
some
and
people
again,
like just driving
Yeah.
their truck around, that's for sure. You
yeah,
Yeah.
know,
if listeners
but
We have some
actually,
people who just like to watch it burn. Um,
no,
yeah,
but
and if
no.
listeners do, then absolutely, then that's helpful. But I would hope the majority don't just sit there watching their lamp in order to say, great, I'm now using electricity. So if we can get where we want to, if we are happy and spending time with friends and family doing what we want, if we have, as we do right now, computers and internet when we need it, we can turn on the lights when we need it, when we got hot water, it doesn't matter how much energy we're actually consuming, or electricity in a lot of these cases. So that's where it's about demand reduction. It's not just renewable supplies, but it's about using less,
Yeah.
ensuring that people are still at a comfortable level of consumption. And this is absolutely where people then raise the issue, well, does this mean, what does this mean for population numbers? And there's no doubt that it's that balance between consumption per individual, but also the number of individuals.
Mm.
So I'm not advocating that we go out and say, well, who's going to live and who's going to die? We are well beyond the Malthusian arguments, which have absolutely been debunked and really don't have validity. What we do know is that to have internet and computers and light and hot water, be able to travel, again, to have fulfilling jobs and livelihoods, to have healthy lives, healthcare when we need it, and enjoy our environment and our friends and families, there's an appropriate level of consumption which is beyond subsistence living. For everyone to have that, which I think is fair on this planet, there will be a maximum number of individuals. What that maximum is, I don't know. I've seen so many calculations with huge ranges. It really does come down to the fact that individuals need to consume in a balanced manner, and we do need some form of ethical ways of having an appropriate number of individuals. Again, this isn't going out and saying, big picture, government is going to tell you how many kids to have, which is patently ridiculous. No one's advocating that. Or government will come and knock on your door if you have your light on for too long. No, it's saying, well, do you want more time with your friends and family? Do you want more time to yourself? Do you want to ensure that your loved ones are going to come back from their job at the end of the day rather than being killed on the job?
Mm.
Do you want quality of life? And to do that, overconsumption will diminish because overconsumption harms us mentally, it harms us physically, and it does not improve our quality of life, our lifestyles, or our livelihoods.
Yeah.
and the reason I asked that is because, I mean, to some degree, like the point of the work I do, a lot of it has been actually to sort of like, hopefully, seed and seed an idea amongst conservatives in America where this used to be completely like non like this used to be a conversation you really couldn't have with that rancher who hates Agenda 21. I think for various reasons the American right and American conservatives have moved in a much more sort of like green-minded direction in
Yeah.
various but you hear that demand reduction, and that translates on Fox News to they're coming after your quality of life. Demand reduction becomes a proxy, like in American conversations, for quality of life being essentially reduced.
Then
And
flip it around and just say, do you want a better quality of life?
right, and that's the thing is like I think that actually has to be some kind of like a takeaway from here for me would be selling the idea of demand reduction as an improvement in quality of life. That's always been a very difficult sell, particularly in the United States. Um, but I think it's a conversation that if you care about this stuff, you kind of have to want to win. Um, and so
Do
it's
you want to be paying less money to the CEOs who have yachts? Do you want to be paying less money to all these foreign companies that are controlling America?
Well, yeah, I
Well,
mean, I think you have and actually one thing I realized in the course of my dissertation work and since is like you have a better inroads for that argument in terms of sovereignty and self-reliance among conservatives than you do even among like urban elite liberals. Because the elite liberals will be like, everyone else should reduce their demand, but I'm gonna fly to every conference. And a lot of people, only the really extreme committed environmentalists will like not, just consume to whatever level they want. And I think there's an extent to which you can make the case you're independent and sovereign and self-reliant, not having to buy propane, but instead having like a sustainable wood stove that's, energy efficient, et cetera, that kind of thing. But again, going back to Elon's point, it's about like solving a specific problem. And it maybe not just disaster preparedness, but just like, independence and self-reliance as opposed to reliance on these big, corporations and this bill you have to pay.
And quality of life,
Yeah.
filling lucrative jobs. All of those come by not being subservient to those external forces forcing us to consume far more than we really need to.
Yeah.
So Elon, we've already done about an hour here. I was wondering if you could give us on two fronts, if this is okay, Ashley.
Yep.
I was going to ask on the political front and on the climatological front. Maybe starting with the climatological front. What do you think we're going to see in the next few years? Is that channel in the Atlantic, the cycles, the warm water and the cold water, is that about to reverse and Greenland's going to slide off?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah.
Or like what should we get prepared for?
Yeah, so the technicalities, it's AMOC,
Yeah.
which basically is the technical term for Gulf Stream, and there's this big question, will it slow down? Will it actually stop? These are uncertainties and these are unknowns. We talked about heat humidity, which is heavily impacting us now, causing major problems. There's a lot of other scenarios which in the future could be as problematic. And yes, absolutely, these huge ocean currents changing, the possibility of the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland melting, and there's many others. What do we want, or what will we see? Well, a lot of that is up to us. We cannot escape the heat humidity that's with us for a while. The more we do now, it simply won't be as worse. And the more we do now, we can potentially avoid these large-scale changes, which are very unlikely in coming years, but they are certainly possibilities towards the end of the century and in coming centuries. I think, again, we've probably lost most of conservative America now just talking about that. So why mention the C word? I mean, why even talk about climatological as opposed to saying, well, what do you want? And then really respond to that in terms of quality of life. However, if we do want to keep what Ashley, you called what the liberal elites, the liberal
Yeah,
urban
I may have
elites,
said that.
if
Urban
we want to
liberal
keep them
elites.
on board,
Yeah.
well, where are we going with climate change? That's up to them. That's up to us. If you want to stop it, then we've discussed, as you said, James, for more than an hour, and we've all of Ashley's podcasts and all of your amazing writing, James. We know what to do. So if the liberal elite don't want to see a degradation in the climate, if that phrase makes sense, then let's act now. The best time to act was probably about 250 years ago. The second best time to act is today.
And then,
People
oh,
go
go ahead.
back in history and kill baby Hitler, but we could go back and just stop the internal combustion engine from being invented.
I know, or I would love to, let's just do another complete podcast about, I was on a panel with this guy years ago when he was working on this book, but that book Losing Earth, where it was like sort of all about how in the 80s, if they like some guys in a room had made different decisions, like none of this would have happened. And I would
Right.
sort of like get your
That
take
would
on
be
like
fun. Yeah.
how true that
Counterfactual.
picture is and that
Another
sort
world.
of
Yep.
leaving that aside, but sort of to the same point. Okay, you say we can act. These are things that are preventable in certain ways. Okay. Uh, America now has a president, an incoming president, and potentially one of what may be one of the wildest and most chaotic administrations that we're going to have seen this side of World War II. So I'm not asking you to predict precisely what Donald J. Trump is going to do in any of this. However, I think we can sort of look at that election and think probably things are going to change from the approach the Biden administration was taking. And I think we can probably agree that absent that approach in the international arena, that is going to change climate policy around the world. And so I'm just wondering, like, what you foresee in terms of international action, steps that are being taken at a global level, how that might change, where that might leave us, that kind of thing.
Yeah, specifically for human-caused climate change, it will be problematic. Will it be more problematic than the past 30 years? I haven't seen much happening at the international level in the past 30 years.
Mhm.
So if we're concerned about human-caused climate change, then let's do what has to be done without worrying, apart from obeying the law, absolutely, without worrying about the policies and ideologies coming from the federal level. On the other hand, why are we talking about climate change? We absolutely know that there are plenty of good arguments for improving our land use, reducing pollution, including fossil fuel combustion, without mentioning climate change.
Mhm.
Do you want cleaner air? Reduce fossil fuel use.
Mhm.
You want lower taxes? Reduce fossil fuel use.
Mhm.
The final irony being that fossil fuels are not being renewed. They were formed and that's it. They are a finite resource.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they
I
last
thought they
50
were biogenic.
whether they last 50 years or 500 years, they are going to run out. So why don't we take charge of our own species and say we need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels anyway? Let's do it.
Mm,
Particularly because so much, I mean, you alluded to this earlier and we didn't quite get into it. So much of everything we use, including our computers now, come from fossil
I
fuels.
know.
Our clothes, our plastics.
Yeah.
So why are we combusting them when we don't need to? Imagine if we could then use plastics for the next 2,000 years because we had the foresight to reduce how we're using them in energy production or to reduce how we're using them in electricity production and in vehicles and transportation.
Mm.
So it's up to us. Again, do we want better quality of life? Do we want to assume that bioplastics are going to innovate our way out of the problem and be fine, but then where do we grow the bio when we need food? Or do we want to say we're in this for the long term at the millennial scale? We can immediately reduce how much we're consuming fossil fuels to recognize we're going to wean ourselves off them and then potentially have all the things that we enjoy from plastics and from other fossil fuel products until we come up with appropriate sustainable alternatives.
Yep. Yep. I mean, and I mean, that the message is loud and clear. And I think this, you're probably, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the whole world of climate scientists, but I don't know a lot of people who have this same message, which is maybe we should stop talking less about climate change and more about specific like land use. Do you want clean air? Do you want topsoil? And I think like James, if we're thinking, I mean, in our sphere, we have people who are like on the policy side who might actually have the ear of various, Department of Interior, but whatever, Department of Agriculture. What would we advocate for if we're worried about climate change? Not climate policy, but topsoil policy and land use policy and clean air policy and pollution. And those things are all a lot more straightforward anyways, and people can get behind them. People want a clean environment, you know?
And self-sufficiency. And I mean,
Right.
that's the Thomas Massey thing. It's like Thomas Massey, I mean, he's got a Friends of Coal sticker on his Tesla, but he himself, I mean, yeah, so this is the irony, right? Is like
Yeah.
there's layers of self-sufficiency, and for someone like him, he would regard economic self-sufficiency for Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia as being bound to the future of coal. All right, fair enough. But his actual lifestyle is this kind of Americanist Jeffersonian vision of a person who's not bound to huge systems. And that has led him in his personal lifestyle to withdraw from, a
Like
lot of,
low energy, low
yeah,
tech,
he's
basically.
off the grid, right?
Yeah.
Um, and powers his house by solar. So if
Yep.
you can sell it as self-sufficiency, as Thomas Massey, an advocate of coal, himself lives, then you can start winning these
Well, and
fights.
I think, and on top of it, part of it too is to not be so puritanical about, and we were talking about this before we started recording, who is in your coalition. Like, you can agree on some things and not on others. You don't have to do these like purity tests of like, well, whether or not I would work with this guy who is himself a living example of like a low, I mean, actually kind of like a medium tech because he like rigged up this system. He's an MIT grad, rigged up the system in his house so that he's off the grid completely. But super low energy use builds the house from the materials on the land. Like this is the kind of future we want. We want this sort of self-sufficient, hyper localist, like pride of place, but also not overly consumptive for no reason, not overly reliant on these large systems, type of guy. And we can disagree on some things, but then also say, like, this is unequivocally good and this guy's in our camp. He's under our umbrella and we should think of him as such,
Yeah. I think it's not a thing that's going to happen in this administration, but I think over the course of time, I'm actually quite optimistic that like a vision of self-sufficiency and, I mean, to use a loaded term a little bit, like American patrimony, like as something that this being a continent that people conquered and now have to preserve, like that actually, like you can sort of sell American right wingers on that. I actually am bullish on that and have been since I was a child. It's kind of why I do this work. The other thing is that maybe a 10% across the board tariff under a Trump administration will crash the global trading system.
This is another thing. This is what I'm saying. Like, it's so chaotic. You don't
never know. Yeah.
And in some ways, like the Trump administration, in the reason they're doing it might not be something you'd agree with, or maybe it is for some reason, but not others, whatever. But it's so much more chaotic, and there's actually like some hope in the chaos than there is like in a the straightforward, this is going to be like the uniparty neoliberal, like technocrats going forward into the future forever, is way more depressing because you're like, oh, there's no movement here. There's no possibility here. It's always the same thing. As opposed to, I mean, not that I'm like, big conservative or anything, but it's just like, well, I don't know. Let's hope. Let's hope that there's something positive here.
And if they do good stuff, like they won't face vicious pushback and like further division along like making environment like a culture war thing.
Yeah.
So like, which has always been the problem in the US is like whenever a liberal administration does stuff, then you just have half the country go, I hate that stuff because you guys did it.
I hate it because you do it.
And so like any small positives that could come out of this, I think that in a weird way will be more sustainable because you won't have this immediate regulatory shift.
Totally. All right, I've got to run, but let me give Ilan the last word.
Yeah, please.
Yep. Any final thoughts?
All of us, no, all of us having words, not just the last word, but beyond that. And this has been wonderful. I mean, you two have an incredible wealth of knowledge, experience, and wisdom, as I'm sure our listeners do. And that's where together we can be stronger. As Ashley said, we may not agree on everything. We can certainly find what we do agree on. And sometimes the action is the same, even if it's for different reasons.
Yep, totally.
Great.
Amazing. Thank you both
so much. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on again. That's awesome.
This is great
to chat. Thanks for everything and for what you two are doing. It's amazing.
Great. Talk to you both.
Bye.
Bye.